A review of Dismantling Contemporary Deficit Thinking by Mike, Avi, and Ryan. Inaccurate Studies on Poverty, Part 1. Chapter 3 is focused mostly around debunking the theories of Ruby Payne, Oscar Lewis, Edward Banfield, and several other professors who have conducted inaccurate studies on poverty culture. Though Valencia gives some credit to the studies, most especially Harrington's, he argues their validity and accuracy. Inaccurate Studies on Poverty, Part 2. Oscar Lewis says there are 4 main traits that typify poverty: the connection between the culture of poverty and the larger community, the makeup of slum communities, the makeup of family, the values, attitudes, and character configuration of an individual. Oscar Lewis also claims that most white, Puerto Rican, Latino, African American people in poverty share a common design for living. Edward Banfield argues that people in poverty are impulsive, imprudent, not interested in work, violent, hypersexual, and have self-contempt. Inaccurate Studies on Poverty, Part 3. According to Valencia, many people think that those living in poverty are doing so because of their dysfunction and shortcomings. In application to the classroom, these stereotypes get even worse. Here are some of the quotes about behavior related to poverty in a classroom from Ruby Payne's article, Poverty Series, Part 1. If a student cannot follow directions, this means they have little procedural memory. If a student cheats or steals, this means they have a weak support system, no role models or emotional resources, and it may indicate extreme financial need. If a child laughs when disciplined, it's a way to save face. If a child is giving angry responses, it's anger based on fear. Studies from Richard Valencia. While quoting the work of Randy Boomer and Anita Bond, Valencia agrees that Payne is perpetuating negative stereotypes by equating poverty with people of color. Although there is a correlation between race and class, this does not justify Payne's use of racialized case studies. Valencia says that Payne's work is self-promoting and self-published, and she doesn't have peer review as real scholars do. Throughout the chapter, Valencia gives many examples of the stereotypes that Payne assumes onto especially Latino students. At-risk students, a short history. Going back as far as 4 centuries, students have always been determined to be at risk for having academic and social problems. According to Walloons, parents were responsible for instilling discipline, obedience, and self-denial in the children's salvation to be a high priority. Children who lacked these qualities were determined at risk. Defining at risk in the modern day. Today, being an at-risk student is to be less likely to be able to transition into adulthood and live a successful life. Today, students can decide to fail. They have that choice. Swanson says many at-risk students today come from homes that do not have the same reverence for our institutions and desire for an education. Swanson continues to say that children who don't desire an education won't get one. Valencia, however, makes a different argument and states that there are no at-risk students, but only institutions that don't provide personally for them. Thinking about at-risk by Ryan. Though it seems like a great idea, I wish I could completely agree with what Valencia is saying. It would be great if every student was able to get the optimum education in school, but sometimes teachers can't give a student what they need. I'm a strong believer in school not being for everybody after 8th grade. In fact, I think there would be a lot less at-risk students if getting a degree wasn't so important to so many people.
Okay, so in Chapter 5, Valencia goes into detail about the more concrete strategies and ways of thinking employed by the various educators across the country that try to push this against the status quo of deficit thought. And to this end, he pulls from an enormous amount of sources, including Sherry Marks, Bernice Loft, and Patricia A. Young, and uses the writings of Thomas Sowell as an example of deficit thinking in attribution of individual problems to an entire race. So, Thomas Sowell says that the goals and values of Mexican Americans has never centered on education. And so his argument is that Mexican Americans do not hold education high in their value hierarchy, which leads to inadequate familial socialization for intellectual competence, which leads to school and academic failures of Mexican American students and youths. And this is deficit thinking, is that it postulates that personal failure is rooted in values, and Valencia argues that behavior cannot be equated with values. One of the first people mentioned by Valencia is Sherry Marks, a professor at the School for Teacher Education and Leadership at Utah State University. Sherry Marks makes a lot of important points about teachers being facilitators of deficit thought, and she has steps devised to combat that in pre-service teachers, also known as teachers in training. She outlines a 7-step process to combat the deficit thinking displayed by predominantly white female student body that she oversees that would become teachers. So this involves acknowledging one's own racism and its hurtfulness, 2, bringing attention to the logical contradictions that exist in forming these beliefs, 3, seeing the lack of evidence that substantiates these claims, 4, challenging easy answers such as like, oh, I have a black friend, I can't be a racist, or something along those lines. 5, drawing attention to how holding these beliefs and whiteness as a whole can impact children of color. 6, drawing attention to how holding these beliefs perpetuates the problems of whiteness and keeps them, and emphasis on perpetuating them. And 7, moving past the guilt associated with white racism. Next, Valencia turns to the writings of Bernice Lott, who outlines that schools must accept 2 key principles in order to move away from a system of deficit thought. And the first one is schools and family are positive resources as they equal the foundation for further development. And the second, that schools must encourage parental participation and provide them with the opportunities for involvement and that participation. She then goes on to outline some of the obstacles that low SES, also known as socioeconomic status, parents face as a result of being alienated from the educational process, and that is that they view the school as external to their sphere of influence. They can fear the reprisal of teachers and school and staff on their child should they try to speak up and advocate for the child, and they face general economic plight, such as job security and child care issues that would also interfere with them getting involved in the educational process. To this end, Valencia suggests schools should take a more proactive approach to parental involvement, and they should take steps to schedule conferences in the evenings, provide transport and child care for students and parents, and have translators as part of their core staff to help alleviate language barriers. So Valencia then brings up a concept from Mackenzie and Shirich known as an equity trap, and that's defined as a way of thinking and set of assumptions that prevent educators from believing students of color can be successful learners in the same way that white students could. And this manifests in 4 different ways, but Valencia only discusses 2, the first of which is a deficit view, which is, as we know by now, an attribution of lack of success to internal deficits. Thomas Sowell, of course, suffered from this viewpoint as a common deficit viewpoint. Equity trap is believing that parents of a certain child or group do not care about their child's education, which he said about Mexican Americans. And there were 3 suggested solutions to this kind of equity trap. The first one outlined is a neighborhood walk that are door-to-door to introduce and distribute info about the school and educational things to parents directly, and it's aimed at increasing rapport and parental participation. There are oral history projects in communities to take notes and do a presentation on some figure in the community of noteworthiness, and that can bring the community and education closer together into a more solitary community. And there's 3-way conferencing, which is a conference like a parent-teacher conference that also involves the student, so the student can have a voice in their instructional decisions at school and at home. So the second kind of equity trap is known as paralogical beliefs and behaviors, and that involves with paralogism, which is basically things that are illogical when you draw a conclusion from premises that do not logically warrant that conclusion. So, for example, a teacher saying, "Oh, I yelled at the student because of something that they did that made me angry." When you are not really getting mad because of something the student did, it's more mad of the disorder in the classroom or the feeling that you are not in control. So paralogical beliefs have some solutions that have been proposed in the book, and one of them is for principals to have teachers visit schools and classrooms where there already are success working with students of color, and using these already functional and thriving communities in the classroom as sort of a role model to act as a base or a coach for other successful interactions and for successful interactions to spread. The third way is for developing a critical mass of equality advocates and those interested in social justice within the teacher base, because those who are take social justice and equality to the core of what defines them as a teacher are they're not immune from deficit thinking. They are far more aware of it than their counterparts who may not be. And so then Valencia talks on the subject of social justice, because in today's day and age, youth are becoming radicalized in ways that really haven't been seen before. And issues pertaining to like this nebulous concept that is social justice kind of have a presence everywhere, in courtrooms, at home, in the school, and beyond that. So to this end, social justice and anti-deficit thinking kind of go hand in hand, in that employing social justice leadership and principles is a given if one is to end and curtail deficit thought. So Goldfarb and Grinberg describe social justice as a transformative institutional change with an emphasis on equality, while Bagach, I think that's his name, I probably butchered that, elaborates that no fixed or predictable meanings to social justice kind of exist and cannot exist prior to engaging in educational leadership practices, getting at the root that education is kind of the baseline for all of this. And so the difference between an educational leadership is that you make the school great through your hard work, while a social justice leadership becomes entwined with the life and the community and the very essence of the school, becoming a part of the school rather than making it great as an outside force. So in talking to principals who advocate and believe in social justice, the four kind of stratagems that they cited were increasing student achievement with high expectations and taking local data into account as well as national data, and testing many students to get a more accurate average, improving the structure of schools by things like including special ed students fully, and greater access of advanced courses, challenging the deficit thinking of teachers when it arises, not being afraid to take that leap, recentering and strengthening staff capacity with professional freedom and empowerment, and strengthening the school culture and community as a pleasant place to welcome, and a pleasant and welcoming place to, especially for marginalized families. So I thought that this chapter was it struck me as very different from the things that we talked about and from a lot of the other things in the book, in that it was very concrete in a lot of places and offered solutions. While in class we talk about problems and how the problems manifest in our lives and what we would do in certain situations, we never really talk about solutions that much, because when you get out of the abstract and into the more concrete, it's a lot easier to pick things apart as being something that'll work or something that will not. I remember in class once I proposed the idea that schools could maybe bus students to whatever kind of rally they want to go to, and then of course the logical step after that is somebody bringing up, oh, what if there's a rally that's a hate speech rally that a student wants to go to. And so this is a kind of, it's along those lines, but it's way more thought out and has success of actually working in an educational facility, and that was very interesting to me. And I liked this chapter.
Alright, so now we are moving on to Chapter 6, which begins with high-stakes testing and social promotion. So we can talk about high-stakes testing and what that means. According to Valencia, high-stakes testing is part of the standards-based school reform movement. High-stakes testing might take the form of an ACT, gain a certain score so you can go to college, but they might also be tests that are necessary for one to pass if they want to graduate or even move on to the next grade level. So if a person does not pass that test, they might be held back, or they might not be able to graduate. High-stakes testing is also intended to provide the public who provides the school with funds with numbers in order to show that their students are successful. The author Valencia says that high-stakes testing, standards-based school reform movement, and accountability in public education are all very, very much intertwined. High-stakes testing provides numbers, provides standards that need to be met in order to prove to the public that the school is successful. Things like exit exams that I just mentioned, as you can see on the slide, 72% of people who are currently in American schools will have to take an exit exam to graduate. But I think the really powerful number up there is that 82% of minority group students and 87% of English language learners will also need to take the test in order to graduate. So this disproportionate statistic, these high numbers of minority students, of English learners, shows that there definitely is an institutionally oppressive system at work. Because if these students do not pass this test, that means that they cannot graduate. And this is, mind you, exit exams are just one score. One score that will determine if a person can get a degree, which oftentimes determines the jobs that one can get, determines how much one can function in an American economy. The idea of, part of the standards-based reform movement is also social promotion, which is, and high-stakes testing is often used for grade promotion. Social promotion is the idea that the objective is to get students onto the next grade, keeping up with their peers without really caring whether or not the student has actually mastered the material that they were intended to learn in that grade. So if a student passes a test, it may not show their complete comprehension of the subject, but the student is still promoted into the next grade. With high-stakes testing, something that happens is that teachers begin teaching for the test instead of teaching a curriculum that might involve valuable information that students need to succeed. I remember when I was taking the ACT, we had to memorize sheets of language that might pop up on the test, completely obscure rules of grammar and certain poetry structures that even as an intended English major, I haven't seen since. So students might not necessarily be learning the valuable information, the history of their country, or the history of their culture that they might need to receive to be able to function in their communities and in the American economy, and instead just learn how to pass a test in order to move on to the next grade. So really what's largely problematic is that this is one score largely determining a person's entire ability. I haven't seen the statistics So I can't say how often it happens that somebody who performs very well in school in terms of grades doesn't pass these exams. I can imagine that doesn't happen very often. But still, if, it's ridiculous that so much can rest on, especially with external factors, especially students of low SES backgrounds, if they have a hard time getting to school, if they have a difficult time getting enough to eat, these factors all might collapse on them the day that they have to take this test. And I think that's just completely absurd. And I can speak from personal experience in terms of ACT scores. As Dr. Nate said in class, for the past 40 or so years, we have known that socioeconomic status most directly is linked to what score you will receive on a high-stakes exam. So, I know that coming from my high school, it wasn't necessarily, some very, very smart people I knew received lower ACT scores. However, it was the students who were able to pay for private tutors and who were able to pay for ACT lessons and who were able to pay for retakes that received the highest scores on the test, which I think definitely proves that to be true. If somebody doesn't have the resources, that might be the thing that makes or breaks them. And that's directly oppressive to students of low socioeconomic status. Now we move on to testing with soul-determinative weight and adverse impact. What is adverse impact? That is when the performance outcome of, say, a test becomes too great between, say, students who are of an oppressive socioeconomic status and students who are of an oppressed socioeconomic status. So when the difference is too great between white students and minority group students, or first language English students and English learners, that means that there is some sort of institutional or systematic pressure happening, maybe, that is preventing the oppressed students from succeeding. The author also talks about Campbell's law as a reason for these tests not necessarily being valid. Campbell's law states that the higher stakes something is, it is more susceptible to corruption, and in this case, the higher stakes a test is, supposedly, it will lower the test's validity, which means its ability to test what it's meaning to test. Now, I believe that the connection here, although I couldn't really understand it from the text, is that companies need some students to do very, very well on the test and some students to not do as well. So I suppose that they can't just test students on information. They have to perhaps direct the test. I don't know how they would go about doing that, in order to make sure that some students do succeed and to make sure that some others fail. Yes. And then, when students of color, when students of low socioeconomic status don't do very well in these tests, and they may not be able to graduate, or they may not get a very high ACT score, not be able to get into the institutions of education they would like to attend. And when these students are blamed for their scores, it's really observing the symptom over the root of the problem. Like I was talking about earlier, of students have other factors in their lives that might be preventing them from getting the proper preparation for these tests, such as lack of accumulated wealth because their family's racial group has previously been oppressed, or something similar. These tests really focus on what the students are not succeeding in based on a white-dominated education system standards, and therefore overlooking systematic oppression, overlooking institutional oppression that has plagued these students their entire education. For example, if you look at the cartoon, it says to ensure fair selection, you all get the same test, you must climb that tree. And many of those animals are not meant to climb trees. Just as, that's a test that would be designed for, out of all those animals, the monkey, or maybe a bird. But similarly, if you are to design a test in a white-dominated school system, it is most likely going to be made for white, high socioeconomic status, perhaps, students.